He stood by the graveside, the damp earth clinging to his polished shoes, a scent of rain and lilies heavy in the air. Mark felt a hollowness inside him, a vast and echoing space where his mother's warmth used to be. The world had lost its colour, muted to shades of grey and black under the weeping sky. A tear traced a slow, cold path down his cheek, but he made no move to wipe it away. It felt like a final, physical connection to the grief that had consumed him since the phone call came. His mother, Evelyn, was gone. Beside him, his wife, Eleanor, shifted her weight impatiently. She was a stark, fashionable slash of black against the sombre greens of the cemetery, her designer dress impeccable, her expression a mask of bored tolerance. She had not shed a single tear. The minister's voice droned on, a comforting murmur of psalms and platitudes that did little to fill the chasm in Mark's heart. He clutched the single white rose he planned to place on the casket, its stem thorny and real in his numb fingers. Suddenly, Eleanor leaned in close. Her whisper was not one of comfort, but of sharp, cutting impatience. "How much longer is this going to take? I have a luncheon at 2. Mark flinched, as if struck. He didn't turn his head, keeping his eyes fixed on the dark, polished wood of his mother's coffin. He couldn't bear to look at his wife's face, to see the cold indifference there. He murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears, "It's my mother's funeral, Eleanor." She sighed, a sound of profound exasperation, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum at an inconvenient time. The service concluded a few moments later. As the final prayer ended and people began to move, to offer their quiet condolences, Eleanor glanced at the sleek, silver watch on her wrist. Her voice was low, meant only for him, but it cut through the atmosphere like a blade. "Finally!" The word shattered what was left of Mark's composure. It was a single, cruel syllable that dismissed his mother's entire existence, his own profound grief, as nothing more than an obstacle in his wife's social calendar. It was the distillation of a decade of slights, of condescension, of being made to feel small and unworthy. He said nothing. He simply stood there, frozen, as his world tilted on its axis. The love he once thought he had for this woman had long since withered, but in its place now grew something cold and hard. After the last of the mourners had drifted away, a man in a dark, well-tailored suit approached him. He had a kind face, etched with the lines of age and wisdom. It was Mr. Harrison, his mother's lawyer and oldest friend. "Mark," he said, his voice gentle, "my deepest sympathies. Your mother was a truly remarkable woman." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Mark managed to reply. Eleanor had already started walking toward the parking lot, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass, a picture of irritation. She called over her shoulder, "Mark, are you coming? Julian is waiting for us." Mr. Harrison ignored her. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, ornate, old-fashioned key. It was made of brass, heavy and solid. He pressed it into Mark's hand. "Your mother wanted you to have this," the lawyer said quietly. "And this." He handed Mark a sealed envelope. "The instructions are inside. She asked that you read it alone." Mark looked down at the key. It felt strangely significant, a relic from a past he didn't fully understand. His mother had lived a simple life, a quiet life. She was a librarian, a widow who enjoyed gardening and classic films. She had nothing that would require such a key. "What is it for?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Harrison gave him a sad, knowing smile. "Evelyn was a woman of many layers, Mark, more than you or anyone ever knew. The will has a specific condition, a very important one. It's all explained in the letter." The lawyer squeezed his shoulder. "Be strong, son, and be careful." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing alone by his mother's grave, a cold key in his hand and a colder feeling spreading through his heart. The car ride home was a silent, suffocating affair. Eleanor drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Her brother Julian sat in the passenger seat, scrolling idly through his phone. Beatrice, their mother, was in the back with Mark, her presence a silent, suffocating judgment. Beatrice had always looked down on Mark. From the day Eleanor brought him home, he was an unwelcome addition to their pristine, pedigreed family. He was a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands. They were a family of finance, of inherited wealth, and carefully curated social standing. Well, that was a dreary affair, Beatrice said, breaking the silence as she dabbed at her perfectly powdered nose with a handkerchief. Evelyn was a sweet woman, I suppose, in her own simple way. The condescension was thick, a familiar poison. Mark felt a surge of anger but swallowed it down. Arguing was pointless. It was like throwing stones at a fortress. Julian snickered from the front seat without looking up from his phone. Simple is one word for it. I'm surprised she could even afford that plot. Prime real estate, even for the dead. Julian, be nice, Eleanor chided, though there was no real heat in her voice. It was a token defense, a performance. She secretly agreed with every cruel word her family uttered. For 10 years Mark had endured this. He had endured the jokes about his quaint profession, the snide remarks about his second-hand car, the pitying looks when he wore a suit that was not from a designer label. He endured it because he had loved Eleanor, or at least the woman he thought she was when they first met. That woman was long gone, replaced by this cold, status-obsessed stranger. She had been reshaped by her family's expectations, molded into a perfect copy of her mother. Their marriage had become a hollow shell, a union of convenience for her, a prison of quiet desperation for him. He remembered their early days when she had claimed to admire his skill, the way he could turn a rough piece of wood into something beautiful and lasting. She had praised his honesty, his integrity, his gentle nature. But over time, her family's influence had eroded that admiration, replacing it with shame. His hands, which she once held and called strong, became coarse. His quiet evenings at home, which she once called peaceful, became boring. His refusal to play the stock market or engage in Julian's risky get-rich-quick schemes, which she once called sensible, became a sign of his lack of ambition. The house they lived in was a perfect example of their dynamic. It was a beautiful, sprawling home in a wealthy suburb. Beatrice had gifted them the down payment, a fact she never let Mark forget. It was her leverage, her constant reminder that he was living on her charity. What they all conveniently ignored was that his own mother, Evelyn, had quietly contributed a significant sum as well, draining her modest savings to help them. "I just want you to be happy, dear," she had told him, and he had never told Eleanor or her family. He knew they would only scoff at the amount, dismissing it as paltry compared to their own grand gesture. Now his mother was gone, and the last buffer between him and the full force of their contempt had vanished. He felt the key in his pocket, a small, hard weight against his thigh. A mystery seed. When they arrived home, Eleanor immediately went to change. "I'm late for my lunch with Richard," she announced, as if he should care. Richard was her new friend, a slick real estate developer with a predatory smile and a portfolio as inflated as his ego. Mark knew, with a certainty that ached in his bones, that their friendship was not platonic. He watched her go, a cold detachment settling over him. He was tired of hurting, he was just tired. He retreated to his workshop in the garage, the one place that felt truly his. The scent of sawdust and wood-stain was a comfort. It was a place of creation, of tangible results, a stark contrast to the empty promises and cruel words that filled the main house. He sat on his workbench and pulled out the envelope Mr. Harrison had given him. His name was written on the front in his mother's familiar, elegant script. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letter was short, but every word carried the weight of a lifetime. "My dearest Mark," it began, "if you are reading this, then my time has come. I know your heart is heavy, but I need you to be strong. The life I lived was not the one people saw. I kept a part of myself hidden, a secret I inherited and chose to protect. I did it for you." The letter went on to explain. The key was to a private vault at Sterling Trust Bank downtown. It contained documents that would change everything, but it came with a warning. "The world you are about to enter is a complicated one, filled with people who value money above all else," she wrote. "People like Eleanor's family. I have seen how they treat you, my son. I have seen the pain in your eyes, even when you try to hide it." Then came the condition, the part Mr. Harrison had mentioned. "My entire estate, the full extent of which you will soon discover, is yours. But there is a condition in my will to inherit it fully and without restriction. You must remain married to Eleanor for 1 full year after the date of my passing." Mark's blood ran cold. 1 more year, 365 more days of this hollow existence, of enduring their scorn and her infidelity. Why would his mother do this? It felt like a cruel joke. But the final paragraph explained her reasoning. "This is not a punishment, my love. It is a test, and it is a shield. This year will give you time to understand what you have, to learn how to wield it, and to see people for who they truly are when they think you have nothing. It is a year of observation. Use it wisely. Your grandfather was a brilliant but ruthless man. He built an empire, but he trusted no one. I inherited his wealth, but not his coldness. I am giving you the power he amassed, but I pray you use it with the wisdom I tried to teach you. This is my final gift to you, Mark. Make them see the man I always knew you were." He read the letter 3 times, the words sinking in. An empire? His mother? The quiet librarian? It seemed impossible. Yet the weight of the key in his hand felt very real. A year. He had to survive 1 more year. But his mother had not asked him to endure. She had asked him to observe. And as he sat there in the quiet of his workshop, the cold feeling in his heart began to solidify, changing from grief into something else. Something hard and sharp. A decision. He would not just survive the year. He would use it. He would observe, just as she had advised. And he would plan. The next day, Mark made an appointment at Sterling Trust Bank. He wore his simple work clothes, a flannel shirt and jeans, knowing it would cause the staff to underestimate him. He was right. The bank was an imposing cathedral of finance, all marble floors and hushed tones. The receptionist looked down her nose at him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "I have a key for a private vault," Mark said, placing the brass key on the polished counter. Her eyes flickered from the key to his clothes, and a smirk played on her lips. "I see. And what is the box number?" Mark admitted he didn't have one. The smirk widened. "Sir, all our vaults are accounted for. Perhaps you are mistaken." "My mother's name was Evelyn Reed," Mark said calmly. "Her lawyer, Mr. Harrison, instructed me to come here." The mention of Mr. Harrison's name changed everything. The receptionist's demeanor instantly shifted. She typed something into her computer, her eyes widening in surprise. She stood up abruptly. "Of course, sir. Right this way. The bank manager, Mr. Sterling himself, will see you." Mark was escorted to a lavish office on the top floor. Mr. Sterling was an older man, impeccably dressed, with sharp, intelligent eyes. He stood as Mark entered, shaking his hand firmly. There was no condescension in his gaze, only a deep, abiding respect. "Mr. Reed," he said, "we have been expecting you. Your mother was one of our most valued and most private clients. Please sit." They went down to the main vault, a place of silent, cold security. Mr. Sterling used his own key, along with Mark's, to open a large, unassuming steel door. The vault inside was not filled with gold or jewels, but with file boxes, dozens of them. "Your mother's holdings," Mr. Sterling explained, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. She was the sole owner of the Reed Global Holdings Corporation, a private entity established by her father, your grandfather, Jonathan Reed. Mark had barely known his grandfather. He was a mythical figure, a man his mother rarely spoke of, and always with a hint of sadness. He had died when Mark was a boy. Mr. Sterling began to explain the complex web of assets. Reed Global was a ghost corporation, a holding company for dozens of other businesses. It owned commercial real estate in 3 major cities, a controlling interest in a tech firm, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, and vast tracts of undeveloped land. The explanation was a dizzying torrent of numbers and corporate structures. Mark felt like he was drowning in information. The total value was staggering, a figure with so many zeros he could hardly comprehend it. It was a fortune built on his grandfather's ruthless ambition and preserved by his mother's quiet wisdom. Then came the most devastating revelation. Mr. Sterling pulled out a specific file labeled Local Assets. He opened it to a map of their very own town. "Your mother was a sentimental woman," he said. "After your marriage, she began quietly acquiring assets in this area through a subsidiary called Ironwood Properties." He pointed to a large parcel of land on the map. "This, for example, is the land upon which the Oak Valley Country Club is built. Your mother's company owns it. The club merely leases it from them." Mark stared, stunned. The Oak Valley Country Club was the epicenter of his wife's social life. It was Beatrice's kingdom, the place where she reigned as the queen of local society. Mr. Sterling continued, flipping through deeds and corporate filings. He pointed to another property. "This is the commercial building where your brother-in-law Julian has his office. Ironwood Properties owns that as well." And then the final crushing blow. He produced the deed to Mark and Eleanor's own house. The owner listed was not Beatrice, who had so proudly gifted the down payment. The owner was Ironwood Properties. Beatrice's contribution had merely been a single payment on a lease-to-own agreement with the very company Evelyn controlled. Their home, their status, their entire world, it was all built on a foundation owned by the humble librarian they had so thoroughly despised. Their wealth was an illusion, a stage play financed by the woman they thought was beneath them. Mark felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. This was the ironic dependency his mother had written about. They were completely, utterly, and unknowingly reliant on him. He spent the rest of the day with Mr. Sterling and, later, Mr. Harrison, poring over the documents. The lawyer explained the legal intricacies. For the next year, Mark was the silent acting chairman of the board of Reed Global. He had the power, but it was provisional. He could make decisions, but he couldn't liquidate or transfer the core assets into his own name until the year was up. "Your mother's condition was a masterstroke," Mr. Harrison said, a glint of admiration in his eye. "It forces you to learn the business, to understand the power you hold, and it protects the estate from being seized in a potential divorce proceeding until you have full control." Mark sat back, his head spinning. The grief for his mother was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but now it was mingled with a profound sense of awe. She had not left him defenseless. She had left him an arsenal. That night, he went home. Eleanor was there, dressed for an evening out. She was on the phone with Beatrice, her voice sharp and annoyed. "I know, Mother," she was saying. "He's been moping around all day. It's been a week. You'd think he'd be over it by now. It's not like she was the Queen of England." She saw Mark standing in the doorway, and her expression hardened. "I have to go," she said, and hung up. "Where have you been? You were supposed to fix the squeaky hinge on the pantry door." Old Mark would have apologized. He would have mumbled an excuse and shuffled off to his workshop, his shoulders slumped in defeat. But this was new Mark. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the beautiful woman he had married, but a hollow shell propped up by a world of lies she didn't even know she was living. He felt a strange sense of pity for her, but it was a cold, distant pity, like watching a character in a tragedy. "I was busy," he said, his voice even and calm. "I had things to take care of." She scoffed. "What things? Sanding a piece of wood? Honestly, Mark. Richard is taking me to the premiere of that new play tonight. Don't wait up." She swept past him, a cloud of expensive perfume in her wake. She didn't notice the change in his eyes. She didn't see the steel that was hardening in his spine. She still saw the simple carpenter, the man she had married and then discarded. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The year of observation had begun. Mark spent the next few weeks living a double life. By day, in the eyes of his wife and her family, he was the same quiet, unassuming man. He went to his workshop, he fixed things around the house, he absorbed their casual insults with his usual stoicism. But in the evenings, after Eleanor was asleep or out with Richard, he would retreat to his study. He spread the corporate documents across his desk, studying balance sheets, legal structures, and investment portfolios. He had regular, discreet conference calls with Mr. Harrison and Mr. Sterling. He was a quick study. His mind, accustomed to the precision and logic of carpentry, easily grasped the complex architecture of his mother's empire. He learned how one subsidiary connected to another, how a decision made in one boardroom could send ripples throughout the entire structure. He was no longer just Mark the carpenter, he was the ghost in the machine. Eleanor and her family, meanwhile, grew more arrogant, more convinced of their own superiority. Their lives were a whirlwind of charity galas, country club dinners, and expensive vacations. They treated Mark not just as an afterthought, but as a piece of furniture they were vaguely embarrassed by. One evening, Julian came over for dinner, bursting with self-congratulation. His tech startup, Innovatech, had apparently secured a new round of funding. "The investors are practically begging me to take their money," he boasted, swirling a glass of wine that cost more than Mark earned in a day. "We're going to disrupt the entire industry. I'll be on the cover of Forbes by next year." Beatrice beamed with pride. "Oh, Julian, I always knew you were brilliant. Unlike some people, you have ambition." She shot a pointed look at Mark, who was quietly eating his dinner. Mark just nodded, a small, polite smile on his face. He knew something Julian didn't. He had spent the previous night reviewing the Innovatech file. The primary investor, the one Julian was so proud of, was a venture capital firm called Apex Capital. And Apex Capital was a wholly owned subsidiary of Reed Global Holdings. Julian was bragging about taking money from a fund that Mark now controlled. The irony was so thick he could almost taste it. He kept his expression neutral, a mask of polite interest. This was the observation his mother had spoken of. He was seeing them for who they truly were, arrogant, overconfident, and completely oblivious. The time for observation was ending. The time for action was about to begin. Mark convened a secret meeting with Mr. Harrison. It took place in a discreet law office in the city, far from the prying eyes of their suburban town. "I'm ready," Mark said, his voice firm. There was no hesitation. "My mother gave me a year to observe. I have observed. Now I want to formulate a plan." Mr. Harrison nodded, a grim but satisfied look on his face. "I thought you might be. What do you have in mind?" "I don't want to be cruel," Mark said, surprising even himself. "I don't want to destroy them for the sake of it. I want to be surgical. I want to use the system they love so much, the system of money and power, to show them the truth." He laid out his strategy. It was not a frontal assault. It was a slow, methodical dismantling. He wanted to remove the props that held up their fragile world, one by one, until it all came crashing down around them. "The plan must be elegant," Mark continued. "It must use their own actions, their own arrogance, against them. They must be the architects of their own downfall. I will simply provide the tools." For the next 2 hours they mapped it out. The first domino would be Julian, the second, Beatrice, the final and most personal would be Eleanor. "We'll start with an internal audit of Apex Capital's investment in Innovatech," Mark instructed. "I want a full financial review. I'm sure we'll find some irregularities. Julian has always been careless with details." Mr. Harrison smiled. "Consider it done. We'll flag it for potential fiduciary risk. That will freeze any further payments and trigger a review from the board." "Next," Mark said, turning to a file on Beatrice's beloved charity, the Worthington Foundation. "I want to commission an independent, anonymous audit of their finances. Tip off the State Charity Commission. From what I've seen, her bookkeeping is more creative than factual." "And for the country club?" the lawyer asked. "Ironwood Properties will review its lease agreement with the Oak Valley Country Club," Mark said, his voice turning colder. "I believe there are several clauses they have been violating for years regarding environmental standards. We will send them a formal notice of breach of contract." Each step was precise, legal, and utterly devastating. It was a cascade designed to build pressure slowly to create a sense of panic and confusion. They would have no idea where the attacks were coming from. After the meeting, Mark drove back home. He felt a strange sense of calm, a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer a victim of circumstances. He was the architect of them. He walked into the house, and Eleanor was there, on the phone, arguing with the credit card company. "What do you mean, declined?" she snapped. "That's impossible. Try it again." Mark walked past her and into his workshop. He picked up a piece of solid oak, feeling its weight, its grain. He was still a carpenter. He still built things, but now he was also taking something apart. And he would do it with the same precision, the same care, and the same unyielding attention to detail. The first domino fell 2 weeks later. Julian burst into the house one evening, his face pale with panic. "They froze the funding!" he yelled, throwing his briefcase onto the floor. "Apex Capital! They're claiming fiduciary risk! Some nonsense about my expense reports! It's a witch hunt!" Eleanor and Beatrice rushed to his side, their faces etched with concern. "What does this mean?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It means I'm ruined," Julian wailed. "Without that funding, Innovatech is dead. My investors will pull out. I'll be a laughingstock." Mark watched from the doorway of the living room, a mug of tea in his hands. He wore an expression of concerned sympathy, a mask he was becoming frighteningly good at. "That's terrible, Julian," he said, his voice soft. "Is there anything I can do?" Julian shot him a look of pure contempt. "Do? What could you possibly do? Do you know people in venture capital? Can you call a board of directors? No, you can't do anything. You're useless." Mark just took a slow sip of his tea. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry you're going through this." The second domino fell the following week. A letter arrived from the state announcing a full-scale audit of the Worthington Foundation. Beatrice was apoplectic. "This is an outrage!" she shrieked, waving the letter in the air. "It must be that dreadful Martha Pemberton. She's always been jealous of my position on the board." They spent days trying to figure out who was behind their sudden run of bad luck. They blamed business rivals, jealous socialites, a vast conspiracy against their family. The one person they never suspected, the one person they never even considered, was the quiet man who fixed the leaky faucet in their kitchen and dutifully took out the trash every Tuesday. Mark observed their panic with a chilling detachment. He saw their frantic phone calls, their hushed, worried conversations. Their world, once so solid and secure, was beginning to crack at the seams. Then the notice arrived for the country club. The breach of contract letter from Ironwood Properties sent shock waves through their social circle. The club was facing massive fines and a potential termination of their lease. Beatrice, as the head of the membership committee, was at the center of the storm. Her phone rang off the hook with angry calls from other members. Her social standing, the thing she valued above all else, was crumbling. She was being ostracized, blamed for the crisis. Through it all, Mark remained the silent, sympathetic observer. He would listen to Eleanor's rants about her family's misfortunes, nodding in all the right places. "That sounds so stressful," he would say. "I hope it all works out." His feigned ignorance was his greatest weapon. It drove them mad. They saw him as a simpleton, a man incapable of understanding their complex world of finance and social politics. His presence was a constant, infuriating reminder of a simpler life they had scorned, a life that was now, ironically, the only stable thing in their collapsing universe. One night, Eleanor came home late, smelling of expensive wine and Richard's cologne. She found Mark in the living room, reading a book. She was in a foul mood. "Everything is falling apart," she said, slumping onto the sofa. "Julian's company is gone, Mother is a pariah at the club, and Richard is starting to pull away. He says he can't be associated with a family in crisis." She looked at Mark, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of anger and desperation. "Why are you so calm?" she demanded. "Don't you care that our lives are being destroyed?" Mark put down his book. He looked at her, the woman who had checked her watch at his mother's funeral. The woman who had treated him with a decade of casual cruelty. "I care, Eleanor," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I just have a different perspective on things." She didn't understand. She couldn't. She was too wrapped up in her own world, too blinded by her own arrogance to see the truth that was sitting right in front of her. The final months of the year passed in a blur of escalating disasters for her family. Julian declared bankruptcy. Beatrice was forced to resign from all her charity boards amid a scandal of embezzled funds. Their friends abandoned them. The invitations stopped arriving. They were forced to sell their cars, their jewelry, anything of value to pay their mounting legal bills. The fortress was crumbling, stone by stone. And then the final notice arrived. It was an eviction letter. The lease-to-own agreement on their house, held by Ironwood Properties, was being terminated due to non-payment. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. This was the blow that finally broke them. The house was the ultimate symbol of their status, the grand stage upon which they had performed their lives of superiority. Losing it was unthinkable. The year was almost up. The anniversary of his mother's death was just one day away. Mark knew it was time for the final confrontation. The reckoning was at hand. The day of the eviction was grey and overcast, the sky the colour of slate. It was a fitting backdrop for the end of an era. A large moving truck was parked in the driveway, and two grim-faced bailiffs stood by the front door. Mark stood in the living room, which was now filled with cardboard boxes. Eleanor, Beatrice and Julian were there, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fury. They looked lost, like royalty suddenly stripped of their kingdom. "I cannot believe this is happening," Beatrice whispered, clutching a string of pearls that was one of the few pieces of real jewellery she had left. To be thrown out of our own home, the humiliation. Julian was pacing back and forth, his face red with rage. "This is a nightmare. There has to be someone we can call, someone we can sue." Eleanor turned her fury on Mark. Her eyes were wild, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. "And you!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You just stand there. All year, while our lives fell apart, you just stood there and did nothing. You watched us suffer. What kind of a husband are you?" "He's not a husband," Julian sneered. "He's a parasite. He's been living off us for a decade." "Useless," Beatrice spat. "Completely and utterly useless." Mark let their words wash over him. He had heard them all before, but this time they had no power. They were the last, desperate gasps of a dying dynasty. He waited until they had exhausted their rage, until there was nothing left but a tense, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room with an undeniable authority. "You're right," he began, looking at each of them in turn. "I have been standing here. I have been watching. My mother told me to observe, and I have." They stared at him, confused. "Your mother?" Eleanor scoffed. "What does that simple old woman have to do with any of this?" A cold, dangerous smile touched Mark's lips. "Simple? You thought my mother was simple?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "That was your first mistake? And your biggest?" He walked over to the fireplace and picked up a framed photo of his mother that they had already packed in a box. He wiped the dust from the glass. "You spent 10 years treating me like I was nothing," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "You mocked my job. You scorned my family. You made me feel like an intruder in my own life. But what you didn't know was that the entire time you were living in my world." He turned to face them, his eyes like chips of ice. "This house? It isn't yours. It never was. It's owned by a company called Ironwood Properties. Your gifted down payment, Beatrice, was just the first payment on a lease you couldn't afford, a lease that has now been terminated." Beatrice's face went white. "That's impossible." "Oh, it's very possible," Mark continued. "And Julian, your brilliant startup, your primary investor, Apex Capital, is a subsidiary of the same parent company, and the Oak Valley Country Club, your social kingdom. It sits on land owned by that company. They've been leasing it for 30 years. He let the information sink in, watching the dawning horror on their faces. What company?" Julian stammered. "A private holding firm called Reed Global," Mark said, delivering the final blow. "Founded by my grandfather Jonathan Reed, and inherited in its entirety by his only daughter, my mother, Evelyn." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence of profound, world-shattering shock. They looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. The carpenter, the simpleton, the parasite. "My mother's will had a condition," Mark explained, his voice devoid of all emotion. "I only inherited her estate if I was still married to you, Eleanor, at the time of her death, and I had to remain married for 1 full year to gain unrestricted control. Today is the 1-year anniversary of her funeral." He looked directly at Eleanor, whose face had crumpled in on itself. "The day you checked your watch and said, 'Finally.' You thought it was an end. but it was just the beginning. My mother gave me a year to observe, to see you all for who you really are, and I did. The audit on your foundation, Beatrice, the funding freeze for your company, Julian, the breach of contract for the country club, the eviction from this house, that was all me. Eleanor let out a choked sob. You did this to us. No, Mark said, his voice hard as steel. You did this to yourselves. I just held up a mirror. This is the world you created, a world built on arrogance, cruelty, and borrowed money. My money! Eleanor collapsed onto a cardboard box, her body shaking with sobs of disbelief and rage. I hate you, she screamed, her voice raw. I hate you. Julian looked like he was going to be sick. Beatrice simply stared into the middle distance, her mind unable to process the complete and utter annihilation of her reality. You have nothing, Mark said, his final judgment delivered. The money is gone, the status is gone, the friends are gone, all you have left is each other. He placed his mother's photo carefully into his own small bag. He turned and walked towards the door, past the bailiffs who were waiting patiently. He didn't look back. As he stepped out into the rain, he heard Eleanor's final futile shriek from inside the house. He pulled up the collar of his jacket and walked away, the sound of the rain washing away the last 10 years of his life. He was free. In the months that followed, the full extent of the family's downfall became public knowledge. Julian was investigated for fraud, his creative accounting finally exposed. Beatrice became a recluse, too humiliated to show her face in a town where she was now a cautionary tale. Eleanor tried to fight the divorce, tried to lay claim to a fortune she now knew existed. But Mr. Harrison, a master of the law, ensured she received nothing more than what was legally required, which, given their assets were all in Mark's name, was next to nothing. She was left with a mountain of debt and a tarnished reputation. Mark, however, did not embrace the lavish lifestyle he could have easily afforded. He sold off the more ostentatious assets of Reed Global, but he kept the core of the company intact. He moved out of the suburbs and bought a modest, comfortable house with a large workshop. He established the Evelyn Reed Foundation, a charity dedicated to funding public libraries, trade schools, and arts programs, all the things his mother had held dear. He didn't put his name on buildings or seek public recognition. He ran it quietly, effectively, finding a deep sense of purpose in using his grandfather's ruthless fortune to create opportunities for people who, like him, were often overlooked. He continued to work with wood. It grounded him, reminded him of who he was. The feel of a well-made joint, the scent of fresh-cut cedar, these were his truths. One afternoon, while browsing a local bookstore, he met a woman named Clara. She was a historian, with kind eyes and a laugh that was genuine and warm. They talked for hours about books, about history, about the simple joy of creating something real and lasting. She didn't know about his wealth. She just saw him as Mark, a kind man with talented hands and a quiet strength. For the first time in a very long time, he felt seen for who he truly was. Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, built on a foundation of respect and mutual admiration. It was the antithesis of his life with Eleanor. A year after the eviction, Mark visited his mother's grave. The grass was green, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree nearby. He placed a bouquet of her favorite flowers, white lilies, on the stone. He thought about the incredible, painful journey of the last 2 years. He had lost his mother, but he had found himself. He had been given a test, and he had passed it, not by becoming as ruthless as his grandfather, but by using his inherited power with the quiet wisdom his mother had instilled in him. He finally understood. True power wasn't about the number of zeros in a bank account or the size of a house. It was about integrity. It was about knowing your own worth, even when the world tried to tell you that you had none. True wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the peace of a quiet mind and the warmth of a loving heart. His mother had given him more than an empire. She had given him back his life. And as he stood there, a feeling of profound gratitude washed over him, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had made her proud.